A reading from the book of Genesis. In the course of the night, Jacob arose, took the entire caravan and crossed the ford of the Jabbok River. After Jacob had crossed with all his possessions, he returned to the camp, and he was completely alone. And there someone wrestled with Jacob until the first light of dawn. Seeing that Jacob could not be overpowered, the other touched Jacob at the socket of the hip, and the hip was dislocated as they wrestled. Then Jacob's contender said, "Let me go, for day is breaking." Jacob answered, "I will not let you go until you bless me." "What is your name?" the other asked. "Jacob," he answered. The other said, "You will no longer be called Jacob or heel grabber, but Israel, overcomer of God, because you have wrestled with both God and mortals, and you have prevailed." Then Jacob asked, "Now tell me your name, I beg you." The other said, "Why do you ask me my name?" and blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, face of God, because I have seen God face to face, yet my life was spared. At sunrise, Jacob left Peniel, limping along from the injured hip. That is why, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the sciatic muscle that is on an animal's hip socket, because Jacob's hip socket was struck at the sciatic muscle. The word of God for the people of God.
Okay. I'm going to do things a bit different this week. Typically when I'm preaching on a passage, I try to stick to the specific part of the story. That's what I'd consider faithfulness to the text and to the lectionary. But as I began reading up on this one, it became clearer and clearer to me that this story is somehow incomplete on its own, without everything that came first. This story is the culmination of everything that happened before it. So before we get to the wrestling match, I'm just going to walk you through Jacob's experiences prior to this night. The story starts with a very pregnant woman named Rebecca, asking a question that many very pregnant women have asked through the ages: why me? Unlike most of those other very pregnant women, however, God saw fit to answer Rebecca. And God said to her, "Two nations in your womb, two peoples from your loins shall issue. People over people shall prevail. The elder the younger shall serve." Inside of Rebecca's loins, there were indeed two people who would soon issue forth, and who had a lot of issues between them already. They did not yet have names, as was the way of their people. Now, as you all know, some twins are identical, and they look the same. And some twins are fraternal, and they still look kind of the same, just as I look like my older brother. But they also have distinctions in their features. While these two as yet unnamed children were indeed fraternal twins, they did not look kind of the same. There was no likelihood that you'd confuse the two. From their time in the womb, there was a vast difference between the two that can best be described in this particular church context as thus. One was a twink, and one was a bear. And the twink and the bear clashed in their mother's womb, which is unsurprising because wombs are not particularly noted for their spacious accommodation. There was little room. They were sharing food and nutrients from a woman who had to eat for three in a time when hunger stalked the land. In a sense, they were set in competition from the start of their existence, from the earliest days of their cells beginning to multiply unknowingly, reaching towards growth. And then one day they had grown enough that it came time for their issuing forth from Rebecca's loins. And the bear began to issue forth first. And I like to imagine that the twink had the shortest little moment to himself in which he thought, "Oh, finally there's some room to move around in here," before realizing that his womb mate had found even more space to move around, and he was beating the twink to it. And the twink didn't know yet that whoever made it into the more spaced first would be granted special status, but something in him said, "Oh, no, you don't." But the bear had a head start. He was already basically there. So the twink did the only thing he could and grabbed the bear by the heel. And so the twink they named Jacob, because he pulled on his brother's heel. The name also implies a sense of deceit and crookedness, and I do just want to marvel for a second that through completely separate etymologies, both Hebrew and English recognize that pulling one's leg means deceiving them. The bear they named Esau, because already he was covered all over with thick red hair. The two had been in conflict in the womb, and then they were born into conflict. Esau was born first, and by that small difference, he was granted the birthright over his brother. But Jacob was not the type to sit quietly. Jacob was the type to fight. He was the type to ask why. Why should he be over me just because he came out first? It didn't occur to him to just accept that that was the way things were. The next part of the story begins with Jacob paying homage to one of history's other less favored brothers, Cain, by preparing a delicious vegetarian stew. Esau came in from hunting because Esau was always hunting, and he was so hungry he couldn't even remember the word for stew. He just looked at it and said, "Bro, if you don't give me some of that red stuff, I'm gonna starve to death," because Esau could be just a little dramatic. And Jacob saw an opportunity, so he says to Esau, "Okay, sure, but only if you give me your birthright." And Esau, still being dramatic, says, "I'm about to die from hunger. What good would a symbolic birthright do me? Take it. Just give me the red." And Jacob says, "Swear to me," and Esau swears, and then he gulps the stew down like an animal at the trough. And of course, materially, it didn't matter much. Esau was still the favored one of their father, because Esau brought home meat. And for whatever reason, at this point in history, that seemed to be the way things worked. One son brought meat, and the father was pleased. The other son prepared a delicious lentil stew, and the father said, "That don't impress me much." Rebekah favored Jacob, but they lived in a patriarchal society, and so their father's opinion carried more weight. So materially, it mattered little. And Esau was the type of person who looked at things materially. Jacob bought the birthright, but Esau would still be given the blessing, and Esau still held their father's favor. Jacob, though, was the type to appreciate the symbolic subversion. Jacob was all about the struggle against arbitrary rules handed down to him from birth, and to him, it was a victory to have undone those rules by his own cunning. And I like to think that even though it never really bothered Esau much, Jacob still took every opportunity to correct others when they called Esau the firstborn. And he would say, "He was born first, but I'm the firstborn. I bought it fair and square." Then inevitably, the day came when their father started to have a bit of a midlife crisis. Now, a lot of time in this story elapses between Isaac's current age, whatever that is, and his death at the age of 180. Sure, he can't see well at all. You'd be surprised how deplorable the state of vision insurance was at the time. And he was bedridden, but it turns out he wasn't near dying yet. Still, it occurred to him at that moment that he didn't know when he would die. Could be any time. So he'd better get around to bestowing that blessing upon his firstborn. But Isaac's the type to appreciate a little bit of ceremony. He still remembers this whole smoke and mirror show his father put on for him as a kid. Actually tied him to a pyre of wood and raised the knife, everything, just to show him a lesson about the devotion to God. He treasures these little moments of ritual, so Isaac says, "Okay, my son Esau, let's have a sense of occasion about this. How about you go out now and shoot a nice big stag. Get that prepared for supper and come back here, and we'll have a full meal to ourselves, just the two of us, before I bestow my blessing upon you." Now Rebekah overheard this, and Rebekah loved Jacob. So she went and she told Jacob, "Listen, I don't know how much time we have. Your father is about to give his blessing to your brother, but we're going to take it from him." And Jacob says, "Mom, he can tell the difference between us. He can't see well, but he's not dumb." But Rebekah says, "Just trust me," and Jacob does. because Rebekah loves him, and more importantly, because Rebekah gets it. Rebekah will always be second to men just by the circumstances of her birth, the same as how Jacob will always be second to his brother just by the circumstances of their birth. And he knows that she appreciates his efforts to fight these arbitrary systems of status. So Jacob grabs 2 baby goats, and his mother cooks them. Then she takes the fur from the goats and she puts it over Jacob's arms and hands and his forehead so he'll feel hairy like his brother Esau. And then she goes in the closet and grabs Esau's garment and throws them over Jacob. And Jacob was like, okay, do you have to dress me like him? Dad can't even see what I'm wearing. And Rebekah says, trust me. And Jacob does, even though he feels weird about all of this, because Jacob already looks like Lon Chaney Jr. in The Wolf Man. What, is he going to stop now that his mom wants him to put a robe on? And Jacob goes up to his father's bed and says, Dad, and his dad says, oh, hey, which one of my sons are you? Because he can't see. And Jacob says, it's Esau, your firstborn. Here's that meal you wanted. Eat up so you can bless me. And Isaac can't see anything, but he's not stupid. So he says, come over here. Let me feel your hands so I can tell the difference. And Jacob presents his hands, and Isaac feels them and says, you know, it's funny, you sounded a lot like Jacob at first, but my, what hairy hands you have. So Jacob gives him the food, and Isaac wolfs down the meat and drinks the wine. But he's still suspicious, so he says, come here and kiss me, my son. And Jacob leans in and kisses his father, and his father smells Esau's garments and says, that's funny. I was still a little suspicious that you might be Jacob, but my, what a healthy musk you have. And Isaac says, okay, I may as well go ahead and bless you. And he blesses Jacob and says that Jacob will be overlord to his brothers, and his mother's sons would bow before him. Not 2 seconds after Jacob left the room did Esau come in, and he's got his father's sense of occasion. So Esau says, let my father rise and eat of the game of his son so that you may solemnly bless me. And after a repeat of the earlier line of question, it becomes clear to both of them that this is the real Esau, and that the other Esau was just imitating. And the real Esau stands up and cries out, no, bless me too. Come on, you can still bless me. And Isaac says, look, I can still bless you, but I already kind of said your brother would be your overlord. And I can't really undo that part because that's not how blessings work. So Isaac gives his other son another blessing that was good, but not quite as good because he'd already used up all the really cool stuff. This is the point where Esau gets very mad. None of this had bothered him before. The birthright was one thing. He gave it away willingly. It was largely symbolic anyway. But now Jacob had stolen the blessing, had stolen this sacred moment with his father, and that was not okay. So Esau decides he's going to murder Jacob. But Esau doesn't have much of a sense of cunning, so he goes around telling everyone he's going to murder Jacob, which is how Rebekah overhears and finds out. And Rebekah is honestly worried the two of them are going to end up murdering each other, and she'll lose both of her sons in the same day. So she thinks on her feet, and she goes to Isaac, her husband, and she says, ugh, you know what I hate? I hate all these Hittite women around here. I do not like them. Like those 2 Hittite women that our son Esau married. Bah! You know, if Jacob married a Hittite woman too, I'd be miserable. And Isaac agrees with her, and then Rebekah says, oh, that gives me an idea. How about we send Jacob off to my brother Laban's? That way he can meet a nice girl from among our own people. And Isaac says, yeah, why not? So they send Jacob off to Laban, and he married 2 of his first cousins. And then Esau saw that his parents weren't thrilled about his wife, so he tried to fix things by marrying another one of their first cousins, but it turns out that doesn't help much. Jacob was then forced to leave. He took it in stride, but it can't have been easy leaving everything he knows, kicking himself along the way for pushing his brother too far this time. Now, a lot of stuff happens to Jacob during the time between leaving and coming back, so I'm going to simplify things here. Jacob labored for Laban for 7 years so he could marry his first cousin Rachel. But then he finds out the next morning that Laban tricked him and he accidentally married his other first cousin Leah. Jacob labors for another 7 years so he can marry the right first cousin this time. Then the two sisters enact their sibling rivalry out with a childbearing competition, which isn't really very fair to Rachel, because it turns out she's barren for a long time until God opens up her womb. And by then, Leah already has 6 sons, plus they both got their slaves involved, and anyway, Jacob ends up with 11 sons. Then Jacob and Laban get into this whole conflict where each tries to outwit the other in the breeding of sheep and goats. And eventually Laban gets really angry when he sees that Jacob is outperforming him. And that's when Jacob decides once again that he needs to split or else he might get murdered. And that is pretty much where the passage from today starts. Right at the exact moment where Jacob is faced with the consequences of his cunning, cornered by 2 men who both want to murder him. Right at the point where he already cleverly outwitted himself out of a home once, and now he's done it again. Now he has no choice but to return home, knowing full well there's every chance that his brother is still going to murder him. All his cleverness, all his struggle has landed him in trouble once again, and he may give his life for it. This is when Jacob finds himself alone at night. Alone in the dark, in the desert, where any number of attackers could find him right now, kill him, and sure enough, a man shows up and they start to fight. And there's not a lot of specifics on what's going on in Jacob's head, but here's how I imagine it. At first, Jacob is fighting for his life. He is terrified. As far as he sees it, the man he's wrestling with is some anonymous attacker, possibly sent by Esau. Jacob's fearful, he's beset upon, and he wrestles with this guy because fighting for his survival is what Jacob knows best. But the wrestling goes on for a long time, very long, long enough for Jacob to realize that this stranger he's wrestling feels familiar. Like he knows this guy but can't quite place it. And after more and more and more time spent wrestling, Jacob begins to realize this guy kind of seems like God. Jacob knows his God, of course, and he knows what it feels like to be in the presence of his God just as much as I know what it feels like to be in the presence of any of you. And he is not certain, but grows ever more suspicious. And as he grows more suspicious, the wrestling stops being so scary. He stops feeling like he'll be killed if he can't fight his way out of this one. He even starts to kind of enjoy himself. And then when the stranger gives Jacob's thigh the slightest touch and manages to wrench Jacob's hip socket, that's when Jacob knows for sure that this is his God he is wrestling against. And now it feels good. It feels like spending time with a friend, and I believe at that point, Jacob begins to realize that at the same time he is wrestling against God, he is also clinging to his God, refusing to let go. The two actions are one and the same. And that's when Jacob realizes that he's been getting this wrong for his entire life. Jacob has always felt the need to fight to prove himself. He was born at a disadvantage. He had to struggle to be recognized. He fled his brother and had to prove himself to his wealthy uncle Laban by outsmarting him. His whole life he's been fighting, and he's fought for so long and so hard that it hasn't occurred to him until now that struggle does not preclude love. That just as he is fighting against God, he is also clinging to God. That even though he fought with his brother, he also misses his brother. That even though he fought against Laban, Laban didn't do bad by Jacob. Well, other than the wrong sister thing. But, Laban gave Jacob food and a place to live, invited Jacob even to name his own wages, which is the entire way that this whole FFA competition they've got began in the first place. Jacob has been so consumed with the fight that he hasn't realized the damage he's done to those relationships. He hadn't realized how much he'd miss Esau until he was gone. He hadn't realized how much he'd hurt Laban by running off in the middle of the night without a word. Hadn't realized how much he treasured the very people he was struggling against. And I don't think Jacob ever stopped feeling that need to fight. And I say that because Jacob and I kind of have that in common. The fight is who we are. It's how we encounter the world. I don't think Jacob could stop fighting if he wanted to. But I think Jacob also learned how to fight with love, how to fight for the things worth preserving. And Jacob became a lot wiser that night when learning to fight lovingly. And then after the wrestling match, after God gives Jacob a new name, Israel, a name befitting one who struggles to hold tight to his God, and after Jacob limps away, Esau comes over the horizon, and Esau runs to his brother and hugs him and kisses him and weeps with joy on seeing him again. When they interact now, there is still a sense of competition between the two, but it's become a competition of generosity and hospitality. Esau tries to return his brother's tribute offerings, and Jacob tells him to accept the gifts, because Jacob already has everything. Their fierce sibling rivalry transforms into the game of fighting over the check at family dinners. It's a new dynamic and a new relationship, one that I don't think would have been possible before Jacob's long night struggle. And I suspect Jacob never really stopped feeling the need to fight. But I think he learned how to do so without animosity, without the bitterness, without the need to prove himself. After all, once he's made God cry uncle, what does he need to prove to the rest of the world? Thank you.
It's a time in our service where we collect an offering. For those attending MCC Boston through our social media, you too can participate by going to our MCC Boston website and clicking on the donate button there for that purpose. Thank you for being a part of our church family. Members and friends of MCC Boston, as MCC, we live out our belief that in the margins we are blessed, and that by our witness we offer messages of liberation and inclusion. Liberation and inclusion, as well as community, spiritual transformation, and social justice are all MCC core values. Inclusion is what MCC understands as our greatest moral value, and resisting exclusion is a primary focus of our ministry. We strive to be conduits of a faith where everyone is included in the family of God and where all parts of our being are welcome at God's table. In community, we offer safe and open place for people to worship, learn, and grow in their faith, and we are committed to equipping ourselves and each other to do the work that God has called us to do in this world. We embrace spiritual transformation by providing a message of liberation from the oppressive religious environments of our day. We believe that when people are invited to experience God through the life and ministry of Christ, lives will be transformed. The heart and core of our being is to do social action. MCC is committed to resisting the structures that oppress people and standing with those who suffer under the weight of oppressive systems, being guided always by our commitment to global human rights. So this week, praise God for the radically inclusive, spiritually transforming message of MCC, and pray for MCC's continued work in social justice around the world. For now, as the basket is presented, please give as you are able, and may God continue to bless you and MCC Boston. Thank you.